Greetings, car fanatics. Today I'll be showing you how to change the ignition coils and spark plugs on my 2008 Porsche Cayenne Turbo. If you watched my previous video, you would have seen my vehicle get towed. I had 70,000 miles on the original ignition coils and one of them went out. I definitely recommend changing out your ignition coils every 4 years or 48,000 miles. Let's take a look at what we'll need. I'll also include a link below in the description on where you can find these parts. First, you'll need some new ignition coils. If you have the V8, you'll need 6 for the V6. You also need some torque sockets. I have a T15, a T30, and also an E12 socket. Additionally, you'll need some new spark plugs. I'm going with the Bosch OEM spec spark plugs. I also recommend having a magnetic spark plug socket. If you're going to use an extension, go ahead and tape that socket on the extension just to make sure it doesn't fall off and get stuck in the hole. I also recommend replacing your engine torque damper because the bushings crack over time. I purchased this OE spec one for about $65 off of Amazon. To remove this, you need a 16mm socket. You also need a ratchet and a torque wrench to install this along with your ignition coils and spark plugs. I'm using a Tektron 3/8 drive torque wrench, which I purchased on Amazon for about 40 bucks. We're going to start by removing the plastic engine covers to give us a little bit more room. It's really easy to take off. They're just held on by a few plastic screws where you just turn them about a quarter turn and they'll pop out. There are a couple T15 screws that hold them in as well, but overall very easy to remove. We're going to begin first with the passenger side. First, you're going to need to remove the engine torque damper. You just need a 16mm socket, and I'm just using 2. And it's going to be a little tight. Just go ahead and give it a nice tug. Once you have the nut and bolt off, go ahead and put it in a nice secure place. Now we're going to proceed to the other 16mm bolt holding on the engine torque damper. Now we're ready to pull it out. Here's the original engine torque damper with 70,000 miles on it. You can see that the bushing is completely cracked. To get to the ignition coils, you'll have to remove this plastic cover. It's held on by 4 T30 Torx screws. The screws on the outside will be hard to reach, so I use a T30 Torx socket with a crescent wrench to just get them loose. From there I was able to loosen them with my fingers. Be careful not to drop any of these screws in the engine bay. With the screws off, all you have to do to remove the cover is just lift them up and play with the clips at the top that hold them in. You should be able to remove this with some fiddling without breaking anything. If you have the older Cayenne 955s, you will have to remove an air separator in order to remove the plastic covers to get to the ignition coils. Now it's time to replace the ignition coils. Start by unclipping the ignition coils. I'm using a flathead screwdriver to help. Now I'm using my E12 socket to remove the screws holding on the ignition coils. Be really careful when removing these because you don't want to drop them. It'll be impossible to find, and these are specialty screws that are very difficult to find, and they're about $5 each. Now we're ready to pull out the ignition coils. They simply pull out, just grab them and give them a nice tug. Now let's take a look at the old ignition coil. You see this big crack on them. This is exactly why you have to replace your ignition coils periodically, because due to the heat and the stress, they will go bad after about 5 years or so, but you want to be proactive so you don't get left stranded if one of these ignition coils fail. With the ignition coils out of the way, we now have access to the spark plugs. I'm using a spark plug socket along with a 6-inch extension. When removing your spark plugs, you might find that it's pretty hard to get off because your spark plugs may have been on there for a while. I'm using impact to help knock the spark plugs loose. Be really careful not to damage your spark plugs or even break them, or else you're going to have a really big problem. Now it's time to reinstall the new spark plugs. Go ahead and hand tighten the spark plugs in with the Bosch OEM spec spark plugs. The great part is you don't need to gap these spark plugs. They already come pre-gapped correctly. When it comes to tightening the spark plugs, Porsche recommends you tighten them to 22 pound-feet of torque. Be really careful not to over-torque your spark plugs, or you could end up really damaging the threads of your engine. With all the spark plugs in, we can reinstall the new ignition coils. Again, when reinstalling the ignition coil bolts, be really careful not to drop them. You don't need to tighten them very much, just hand tighten them. I'd say something around like 5 pound-feet of torque is enough. Next, reinstall the plastic ignition coil covers. And finally, to complete the passenger side, we're going to reinstall the new engine torque arm. As you can see, this one is a OEM spec one. The bushing is fully intact. We just want to go ahead and get this in place. We're going to install the bolts, but we're not going to tighten them all the way. I also highly recommend using Loctite on the bolts. That way, over time, the vibrations don't shake the nuts and bolts loose. So go ahead and get the screws in to make sure everything aligns, and then you want to tighten everything. You're going to tighten both of these 16mm bolts to 46 pound-feet of torque. Alright, on to the final side, the driver's side. We're just going to do everything pretty much exactly the same. Now for the driver's side, there is an additional hose that makes it tighter to reach the ignition coil and spark plug closest to the firewall, but there's a simple torque screw that you can remove, which allows you to move the hose right out of the way. When working on the ignition coils near the airbox, if you want to get extra space, you can go ahead and just remove your airbox. You have these two pins that hold the airbox in place to the actual intake hose. If you twist both of these pins towards each other, so basically the left side, you can twist that one clockwise, and the right pin you can twist that counterclockwise. Just line up the pins with the notches, and you'll be able to pull those plastic pins right out. And if you do this, you'll get a lot of space for you to work on the ignition coils. Alright, now we have everything put back together. Normally I would start up the car and check it out before reinstalling all of the covers and stuff, but in this case I felt pretty confident in the work since I changed out a couple of the ignition coils not too long ago. It's a moment of truth. Let's go ahead and see if the car starts up and if everything works normally. Alright, I'm glad to see that she starts up. Compared to before, the idle is much smoother. It sounds very precise. In terms of how the car feels, before in idle I was getting some vibration through the transmission whenever the car was in gear, but it seems like changing the engine torque damper along with these spark plugs and ignition coils has pretty much resolved 100% of that issue. Well, there you have it, car fanatics. So as you can see, it's not extremely difficult to change out the ignition coils and spark plugs on the Porsche Cayenne. If you were to take it to a shop and have them do it, I'm guessing they would charge you around $1,000, maybe $1,200, because the parts are about $400 to $500 itself, along with a few hours of labor. But it's definitely a great beginner DIY you can do to your car and really get to know how it works. Well, thanks for watching, car fanatics. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Leave any questions or comments below.